inside a lover's ride. Don't be shy, let's get inside. Trip on our dreams, surprise, with our hearts entwined.